Okay, this will be the second part of looking at Ross Gay's poem, Ode to Buttoning and Unbuttoning My Shirt. Please watch the first one so that we can get kind of some discussion going with that. And also it'll help with your prompt for later in the evening, or later today, I should say. So we're gonna jump right back into the poem. I'm gonna share my screen real quick. Here we go. So we were discussing what an ode is, how it's a song of joy, a song of praise, I should say, and how he's moving from one thing to the next inside of this one. I'm trying to think about line and image, but I also want to think about how we can use confusion, this idea of confusion, as a critical observation and what that might actually mean. So we're going to jump right back into the poem. I'll try to mention some places where perhaps some research could come in handy as well. Some of you already done this, for instance, like looking up what an ode is, and then using that as a discussion point to see if you can understand the poem in relation to its historical precedent. That's research, right? That's what that is. So well done on that one. We would just put that source into an enumerative bibliography, and that would let the professor know that this is a direction that maybe you're going to go in to explore to learn more. Remember that when you write about a poem, and you write about any text, your underlying goal here is to fundamentally teach the text to someone in a more complete way. So the questions you need to be asking as you read poetry, and really again any text, is what could be taught, right? What's available for teaching, and how could you then discover it? And that's usually where you have questions, right? That's where you research. That's how you gain more information. So the poem opens that no one knew, or at least I didn't know they knew, what the thin discs threaded here on my shirt might give me in terms of joy. Okay. So about the knowledge here, basically saying that he didn't know, or he didn't think anybody else knew, that these thin discs, the buttons themselves, threaded onto the shirt, could give him in terms of joy. So he's immediately back here to ode, right? Going from joy to ode, and putting it all within the image of a disc, right? Saying that he didn't know that, or nobody told him that paying attention to taking a shirt on and off with the buttons could actually give him a lot of joy. And of course, we can put a question mark here, and we can also research joy, right? The psychology of joy, the history of joy, what is joy? These are words that we use somewhat ubiquitously. I don't know if you use the word joy all the time, but what I mean to say is that we use it with an understanding of it, but it may not be the full understanding. There's a whole psychology of joy. There's a history of joy. There's the religious aspect of joy. There's the secular aspect of joy. So there's always this space to go find more information, more psychology, more the sociological impact of joy, because this is how we, again, further understand a poem's meaning, by looking at its individual words that can be brought down and sort of explained in greater detail. Now we have the longest line. This is not something to be taken lightly. So this here, right, is all of this, right? All of this, the discs, the joy, the knowledge of it. It's not to be taken lightly, he says, because it's a gift of buttoning one shirt slowly, top to bottom, or bottom to top. Or sometimes the buttons will be on the other side, and I am a woman that morning, slipping the glass through its slot. So this is a very literal thing here, and it's important to know this, that traditionally speaking, men's buttons are on the right-hand side of a shirt, and women's buttons are on the left-hand side of the shirt. And this goes back to the aristocracy in England, where you would have been dressed by a chambermaid. So the chambermaid would also, if they were facing you, right, buttoning your shirt for you, or the butler, in fact, that would still have been on the right side for them. And so over the years, it has just been moved over. So women's buttons are on the left-hand side of the shirt, men's buttons are on the right-hand side of the shirt. And he's saying that sometimes, his buttons will be on the wrong side of the wrong side, if you will, of the shirt, and then he becomes a woman that day. And that's a very, let's call that a big associative leap. But there's also here a lot of interesting research you could do. You could read a very interesting gender theory part of this poem right here, where this idea that remember, this is gender. Woman's a gender. It's not the sex of the person, right? It's not female. He's saying woman, which is a social construct. What woman looks like, right? What a woman is allowed to do, as opposed to like what a man is supposed to do. So in other words, a lot of what we understand to be a social construct of gender comes down to clothing. And you know this if you've ever seen babies before. We don't always, but traditionally a baby boy is dressed in blue. a baby girl is dressed in pink. And this isn't because the baby cares, and it's not because we need to know the gender of the baby. That's not really significant for the survival of the baby. It's because it signals to others that this is the gender, right? So clothing and gender have always been connected, though they have changed over the years to what means what, right? And that, everything from like earrings to makeup to what we might call pantyhose. These have moved from the male class to the female class, the man and women. So it's a very flexible, movable thing. In other words, it can move in and out as a button can as well. So he's saying on that morning that he puts his shirt on, sort of the not want to say the wrong side, but in a different way. He says, I become a woman that morning, slipping the glass through its slot. I tread differently that day. In other words, he has this moment in the morning where he's like, oh, my buttons are on the other side. I am a woman now, because this is how women's clothes are made. And he says, when I do that, I just tread. I move through the day differently, because in my mind, he's saying, I feel like it's different. I feel like I've made a change. It's a really beautiful, interesting moment there with this one. And it says differently that day. And one of the things I'm noticing here, just as another way to think about how we read a poem closely, is his use of adverbs, right? He's using lightly and slowly and differently. So I'm starting to see some repetition of adverbs, which may come in handy later. And that's a little bit more nuanced of approach of critical reading and close reading, is to look at parts of speech and how the poem's using them. I don't have an argument for why he's using them yet, but I see them. And when I have that observation, I always want to write that down, keep up with my observations as I go forward. So I tread differently that day, or some of it anyway. So it's still, right, he says, my conversations are different because he is a woman that day instead of a man. And the car bomb slicing the air. Okay. So this is where we always get confused, right? Because it's such a shift into a violent image, right? There is no way that the car bomb here, this image, is anything more than violent. And we know it because the verb is slicing, right? So this is an image of just pure utter destruction. And it's daily. Just like buttoning a shirt, right, is a daily activity, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. He says, well, so is this kind of violence. If we look at it from a global perspective, every day there is violence, right? Not just in the United States, not just in South Carolina, but in the world, there is violence every day. And we've learned how to live in a world that has this violence. It has become, again, ubiquitous. It's just as often that the world will blow itself up in some capacity than it is that we will put on and take off our shirts. That's how I've always read this. Yes, it's a drastic image. Yes, it's violent, but it's just commonplace, right? There's never a time where you turn on the news, and of course right now with the protests happening, of course that's where we see it now. But even before this, right, you could have turned on the news any day, and there's some violent image being presented to you. Maybe it's not a car bomb or an explosion. Maybe it's that somebody drove their car off the cliff to commit like a murder-suicide, or maybe it's a murder-suicide, or maybe it's somebody driving a car through a crowd of people. This is constant. It's a constant part of humanity, right? Just as putting on our clothes. And he's saying that because it's constant all the time, but he has this slightly different view of it because this day his clothes feel a little bit different. Right? And I think that is confusing, and it's meant to be confusing because is that true? Can we change our perspective that simply? It's a great way to look for research. That's like big level research. How do we change our perspective? How do we get a new look at the world? How do we see it fresh? I mean, he doesn't really give us an answer. He's just saying this is how it happened for him. So the car bomb slices the air, and the people in it are different for a quarter mile. Right? All the people, they all look different to him. He sees them all differently when he's thinking in terms of it as a woman. And the honeybee's legs furred with pollen. So so we go from car bomb to people to this honeybee to the pollen. And so it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? This minute thing. So he's basically everything from like the violence of humanity against itself to humanity itself to the honeybee and the pollen that keeps humanity alive. All of it mean another thing to me. Then on the other days, which too have been drizzled in this simplest of joys. So again, joy here. And this is important too, this word thing, right? Again, it's kind of like this idea that they're all just ubiquitous. We can change one for the other, right? another thing. It just means something else to him. He's not saying what it means. He's not saying that it's better that day or worse that day when the shirt's different. He's just saying it's just different. It feels different. And sometimes difference alone allows us to have some distance from what we normally do, because again, we get used to our lives, right? We get used to the activities that we do. And when we're removed from them a little bit, we can see them a little bit differently. I always used to tell students, if you want to see how this is enacted, change something very small in your day-to-day routine and see if you don't have a different experience. And the one I always tell them is, when you walk from class to class, do it with your hand in the air. It's a silly, silly thing. But if you do this and you walk from one building to another building and don't acknowledge to anyone that you just have your hand up in the air, you're going to see things a little bit differently, because you've changed, though in a very small way, you've changed the way you move through the world. Same thing, you could skip from class to class, and that's going to change your perspective of how it is. It doesn't mean that it's better or it's worse. It means it's just another thing as we go forward with this one. So I'm going to stop on that one, and then I'll finish the poem in the next one. I don't want to overdo these videos. So I'll be right back.